Hi, this is Phoenix, and I'm going to talk a little bit about the philosophy of reason. I personally define reason as the ability to literally reason through things, reason being a way of thinking through things and processing things, and what reason generates is our thoughts. I bring up this definition because reason has a very interesting relationship in philosophy. Reason can be seen as a very subjective process, and seemingly realizing that reason doesn't necessarily relate to reality. So, when you first start off with somebody like Aristotle, you're looking at things from a very logical and scientific perspective, uh, especially when considering that Aristotle helped create logic as we know it today, as well as tried to be scientific about his questions and about his approach into the world, basing it off empiricism. What's really interesting about this, though, is that by the time you get to the existentialists, there is a notable split between reality and reason. The idea that reason can't help us understand reality because they aren't the same thing. And this is a very interesting idea to bring up, especially when we look at the history of philosophy. So when we're looking at somebody like Immanuel Kant tries to show that reason is inadequate for helping us understand the world because reason itself, pure reason, generates contradictions. And this cannot help us understand what reality is. Of course, you get someone like Hegel, who is reacting to Kant, who basically says that reason helps us understand existence precisely because existence arises out of reason. It's understandable why reason is under attack, however, whether in, well, specifically in the modern era, because we do see reason as not necessarily being scientific, and therefore it isn't necessarily truthful. I bring up these ideas because I want to argue that reason definitely is related to reality, and that reason is actually an important component to how we look at the world and how we understand the world. I would agree with Hegel and say that existence does arise out of reason, though I think sometimes reason can also arise out of existence. But either way, I think the two are tightly interconnected and interwoven, and we can't have one without the other. Philosophy is always trying to understand things in the world, things as they are, metaphysical concepts, very complicated ideas. But they want to understand these things because they want to know what is actually real. So they're willing to look at one of their tools, such as reason, to be able to try to understand what the world is. And I do have to admit that I think that the Hegelian approach to reason makes a lot of sense, because I do think that we understand reason and existence simultaneously at times. And I think one of the bigger critiques that's being leveled against something like reason, when you get to the existentialists who have that split between reason and reality, I think it's because they want to confront the seeming limitations of reason and our seeming feebleness at understanding reality. And I think all of these are important points. But the reason why I would ultimately say that reason is related to reality is because I think our thoughts are a part of reality. And I tend to be a rationalist in a lot of ways. I don't necessarily share the viewpoint of someone like Miguel de Unamuno, who would imply that ideas are dead and that ideas are simply a form of rationalism which doesn't tell us anything about the world. As you can tell, this is a very intricate and heated argument in philosophy. That is the role of reason. But by looking at all of these philosophers and thinking about reason myself, even though I would acknowledge that there are many things that the mind cannot apprehend about the world, I would say that the mind is still a part of the world, and that is because of the ideas that it generates. It tells us things, reason tells us things, and even if our reason was completely false and misleading us, it would still be evidence of something. It would be evidence of a process, for instance. And I think that there ultimately isn't necessarily this huge divide between reason and reality, between reason and existence, as a skeptic like Hume might imply. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed this talk. Those are some of my ideas, and I think that ultimately this is an important question, because if we ultimately come to the conclusion that thoughts can't tell us anything about reality, then we really aren't sure what we can trust to be able to understand. You could always argue that empiricism would be the way, which would make sense in the history of philosophy and the history of science, that yes, empiricism tells us things, but I really think that the argument is a lot deeper, and I think it's pointing out our own limitations, but also ironically, our own limitations of reason, but also ironically showing us what we can apprehend about the world. And I think that's one of the benefits of German idealism, or idealism in general. This is Phoenix, and I hope you enjoyed this talk. Thank you for your time.